Yeah, it's events like this that actually make Twitter so valuable.
Yeah.
You just can't get the news flow or the information flow from major
Okay.
media
So,
or
hey,
even
it's
the
going
other
to,
sources,
I'll
right?
put it up, and it should be coming up here soon. And we'll record too. All right. So we've got this sorted.
Okay, when it pops up, then I'll ping it out.
All right. That'd be great. What a crazy 24 hours. Come on. Let's go.
Given what 8 years of threat to democracy rhetoric, it's
Yeah.
amazing how little people actually, in terms of believing it. I mean, if people actually believed that rhetoric, you'd think that there would be so much more action. There's certain
Yeah, I mean, when I saw it come out, I was not shocked or surprised at all.
right. I think most people were expecting it, right?
Well, I mean, this is something people have been talking about. Yeah, to your point, 8 years. I mean,
So applying the kind of OODA to this is like, what did we observe? And we're getting all the different pieces of information that you wouldn't get through the major media, through Twitter, different camera angles, videos.
yeah, and I think to your point about the 8 years, that orientation has been shaped, that hive mind has been shaped. So I don't know what to describe it as, but now it's influencing on how people see things and how they make decisions and how they act in loop. It's really something.
Yeah, it's a network tribalism in action.
Yeah, and you've been talking about that as long as I've known you and been following your work. You've been talking about network tribalism for years. I mean, for the people that are listening that don't know, why don't you just give a thumbnail of what that actually is and what we're seeing?
Goes back to how we've been rewired by networking, social networking. It's changed the way we actually process information. So we tend to focus on the pattern matching in order to cope with the amount of information that we're being hammered with. And pattern matching means that we grab pieces of information out of the flow and put them together into a cohesive whole. We don't read everything. We can't read everything. It's too much. Problem with that is that there are a lot of people working on prefabricated patterns for understanding reality, and those prefabrications usually, involve millions of people who are participating to put together a pattern that reflects some kind of tribal identity, usually identification of something they're against, like you're against racism, or you're against Trump, or you're against something, and those patterns are very compelling, and people are trained to actually see the world through those patterns, that tribal lens. They reject the information that is incompatible with the pattern, and they immediately pick out and amplify the information that shows that this enemy is terrible, that shows that this pattern is correct. And so that kind of defined our politics. It's become the basis for how we discuss information, how we process information as a society. That is, if you know anything about tribalism doesn't, it's very black and white. The enemy isn't just an enemy. It's not a person even. It's like this horrible thing, that evil that has to be eliminated. And that kind of polarization is very dangerous, particularly in the current context.
So, hey, John and Mark, I want to take a look at go back to Boyd's work and make sure we all have a good baseline here. So the strategic game of interaction isolation, that's what we're experiencing right now. That's what we're talking about with tribalism. I want to talk about a few things before we dive a little bit deeper into what's happening today. On the show, we've been engaging with a lot of folks from different backgrounds, from neuroscience, biology, cognitive science, psychology, you name it. Here's a few basic things that we're learning about our orientation. And I think, John, you know this, and I think most of our listeners know this. Please add to this as I go through it. We know that humans like to seek low energy attractor states in the external environment. So those echo chambers that are out there, we had that proclivity to move towards those biases, if you will. We know that the human brain is inherently lazy. It's always looking for shortcuts. We know that because 2% of our body weight is burning 20% of our energy. We naturally want to find and seek these low energy states. Humans seek to minimize surprise. This is that new information coming into our OODA loop. So we know in orientation that the synthesis and analysis between genetics, culture, previous experience, and new information is key. And it's that new information flow that needs to be attacked or amplified, dampened or amplified, in order to create a new orientation there. We also know that humans constantly reconstruct the past. And I want to throw out there are many arsonists that have been out in the last 3 or 4 years telling us, suppressing information, condoning the, cancel culture and all that. And today they're turning and saying, well, I didn't know this back then, right? Now these arsonists are turning into firefighters saying, look at all these things that we need to fix. And at the same time, I'm looking backwards and saying, well, you were part of the reason we got here. And then humans see the world from different advantage points. And one great example of that is there's actually a couple. Boyd talks about this quite a bit, or talked about it quite a bit, and that is when we observe something, we actually change what we're observing. We also know when we look at a rainbow, if we close one of our eyes, cover one of our eyes, the rainbow shifts a little bit. So even as an individual, your own sensory capabilities see things differently, and you actually construct that reality as well. So key point here is reality is constructed top down, inside out. That's what we're talking about inside of the OODA loop. That's why this is critical that people understand this. If you understand how we perceive reality, how we plan, how we adapt, then we can get there. And the external environment, this comes from complexity theory, and that is you amplify those things that you want as a leader or a manipulator, if you will. You find those things that are going to benefit your point of view or your advantage, and you amplify that. And you dampen those things that don't. Right. So there's a lot of things going on with Boyd's OODA loop here, the strategic game of interaction and isolation. I just want you to build on that, and then we could dive into what's actually happening today. That way our listeners understand why is the OODA loop so damn important in this age. Thoughts?
Any specific part of that you want to focus on?
Anything you want. Yeah. That's a lot.
Yeah, that is quite a bit. That was great. Wow. A lot of this, trying to make sense of this, is trying to figure out what doesn't fit, what's trying to be, what seems incongruous, what doesn't make sense, from an objective viewpoint, and things like in noticing that this guy was out in the middle of a rooftop and wasn't detected, only 150 yards away. And knowing the history of how these events are usually set up with people who are recruited and then motivated and then provided the weapon and then provided the locale that they should be in. And we do that, we've done that with terrorists in the past, the underwear bomber and people like that, or even the plot on the Michigan governor and the like. It's like, that kind of stands out as like, okay, is this a setup, or, was this an intentional event, or was this not? And trying to process through that.
Hey, John, I want to comment on that. Our background's in aviation. We know that it's hard to go back in time and look at how an aircraft accident mishap. And we can, Monday morning quarterback that all the time, but we weren't there. We weren't in that situation. We don't know what they knew at the time and what was going on there. So I'm not saying that what you're presenting is wrong. It's just, we have a tendency to look back at a mishap in aviation and go, how do they not see this? Right.
Yeah. But I mean, you're good at that too. I mean, whenever I see an aircraft mishap, I run through what they were thinking at the time and how that actually happened. And almost always you could actually figure out exactly what their thought process was. Remember JFK Jr.? The one that crashed his plane into the ocean. I mean, going through that whole process, you could actually see how, that extra weight on his cast on his foot, put a little extra weight on the rudder, and then it's like, losing the horizon because it was a little foggy out, and then you could see how he would get into a little wing tilt, and that would cause him to lose some altitude, and then see him pull, and then see him pull at an angle, and
but
then
even in
you
that
see all the physics
situation,
of that.
Even in that situation, you and I had far greater and better training than he did in that, right?
Right.
Right. So I mean, we were better. We know that, and we could see that. So again,
but you could see that given his limitations, 80 hours of what is it, ultralight training, and then a couple dozen hours of actual flight training, and that how he would fall into this, how he would miss, he wasn't an instrument qualified pilot, and how he'd losing that horizon was critical, and all that, how those things impacted the way he thought, and how he inevitably almost fell into this. He had no chance,
right,
and without the kind of training, without the kind of insight. So I don't know if that's actually the wrong way to approach it. I mean, I can see that you could put yourself in their decision making process and see how they fell into it.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, I think that's useful.
But it's that previous experience that we pointed out there. That's part of that orientation. We had it. We've been trained on it. This setup that we saw yesterday, it's not what I'm trained on, but we are trained to challenge assumptions and run through red team scenarios.
Right.
What is a likely thing that's going to happen today? What's the worst thing? And how would you do it if you, as a maverick coming into this and not knowing the context, how would you do it? So build on that some more, please.
Oh, into this kind of shooting scenario, or the Secret Service scenario, or
the shoot yesterday. Yeah, yesterday's scenario.
Yeah, things that bugged me right off the bat. There wasn't any drone coverage, or it didn't look like there was any drone coverage, because it was been easily picked up. With bystanders actually pointing out, even videoing the guy before he took the shot, see him clamber up. The idea that this guy found the exact point in the coverage that wasn't covered by the counter snipers. The fact that he was a sniper not in the crowd, and it was like so visible on this big empty rooftop, and he wasn't picked up, and that this guy apparently, it doesn't look like he has the kind of training, the expertise, or the to kind of pull this thing off, or even mount this kind of thing without some level of support structure to get him to the point where he is. So all those things kind of hit me, and worry is that also that knowing a lot about organizations, how bureaucracies work. I mean, I could walk into any kind of small company, tech company, or even a big bureaucracy, and after a couple of minutes figure out what's wrong. Not minutes, but I mean, you spend a little time in these organizations, you can actually see where the information flow goes wrong, and what kind of behaviors are actually blitzing or causing problems. Is that looking at the Secret Service and seeing this kind of gap, and seeing this lack of responsiveness to bystanders, leaving this kind of thing open, is a problem. I mean, I think that's it's something that raises a little red flag for me. Was it compromised? Was the coverage compromised in order to set up this opportunity space? Because it had to be a narrow opportunity space. It wasn't like something this guy could discover, knowing everything. He'd have to know everything about everything. It's just not that kind of guy. It didn't look like that from his profile. So there's all sorts of problems with this. And then the larger geopolitical situation is that we're going into a conflict that may end up in World War III, and that Trump looks like he's the kind of guy that will actually come in and make peace with Russia almost immediately. Biden hasn't talked to Putin since the beginning of the conflict, and that he would diffuse it and unwind this. And that's a lot of people have a lot of money and interest in having this continue.
So on the grander context of everything, Mark and we've been in the archives, and I want to point out something. Mark, you might have this available too. This is from 1989 on the strategic game. Boyd starts talking about something very important here. And this is when we think about moral authority, legal authority, policy, and doctrine, what are we driving at? What are we emphasizing? And he goes on to say, focus and direction or social survival via constraints and control, top down. That's what we're talking about in the context of legal, moral authority, policy, and doctrine.
Right.
This raises the question, how do we change these constraints and controls? In other words, how do we change the character nature of these entities? In our Constitution, we have provisions for change. Where do these emanate from? Bottom up, outside in, bottom up. That's the voter. That's us, right? In this sense, from a means end perspective, means determined ends are achievable. Now, going back to what I brought up about attractors and all that, in the world of complexity theory, you want to amplify things. You want to find things that favor your position. For example, and I'll use this as this might be a little controversial. Illegals coming across the border that provide a way for people to vote. And I'm not saying how that works, but
Right.
one, our Constitution is our Constitution. The way, if I recall that correctly, it's ours. I'm an American citizen. It's my Constitution. It's not an illegal's Constitution to change. Mark, I want to hear your thoughts on that, man.
Well, I mean, isn't the Constitution and borders what actually make a nation, right? I mean, that's the compact that we have. And then
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, John. Yeah.
No, just because I'm in the process of writing a report on this, is that where everything went wrong in the mid '90s, as we as a country reoriented from a Cold War stance to a post Cold War stance, and that we made one critical assumption failure, is that we substituted global focus for national focus. You know, we took that global focus, and then it took us down the path on a national security front to go police the world, and that got abused through the neocons and everyone else, nation building, toppling countries, trying to reshape the Middle East and that kind of crap. And then it got abused in terms of trade policy to this, like, let's open up the borders to China, It just NAFTA, the whole thing, it doesn't matter if we lose jobs in manufacturing and all that other stuff. Now we're completely dependent on China for manufacturing, and we're truly screwed if we ever get into a real conflict. And then we globalized in terms of culture too, and so that globalization hit us in terms of de-emphasizing nationalism. You know, the whole national story was attacked and, you know, de-emphasized.
That's what you call the fictive kinship, right?
Yeah. Well, we need, as a country, fictive kinship.
Yeah.
We need tribalism. There's a base level of tribalism, which goes back to Rohnfeldt's characterization. You have the bureaucracy kind of layer, and then you have markets, helps you add a dynamism, and then you have tribalism, which is the oldest kind of way of binding a group. And that's the story that we tell about ourselves and why we're together and why we're better together in the future, right? And if you destroy that tribal layer, you don't have any cohesion. And so we did this through a process of trying to create we destroyed that layer by creating a global utopia where identity, unmoored, unconnected to tradition and history, is more important, and our cultural relativism is not better than the rest of the world. It's actually worse in many respects. Our history sucks. So there's no nationalism, there's no narrative, there's no story. And then that globalist perspective, that utopia, wasn't possible. It's not viable. It's like all three of those things are still in force today. And it explains almost all of the things that we've had problems with. The lack of focus on a national identity and national progress in improving us as a group has destroyed our cohesion, destroyed our ability to act as a cohesive entity, and damaged us in many, many ways. And I don't see it turning around. There isn't really, even with Trump, there really isn't a cohesive or coherent narrative for renationalizing the U.S. And not in a horrible way. I mean, people, but in a way that actually says, okay, we're focused on improving the quality of life for our citizens, and the Constitution means something. Citizenship means something. You can see the globalist perspective on borders. Borders don't exist in the globalist perspective. And a fully realized one, it's like open. And that's the kind of thing we're in right now. As unbelievable as it is, to just open the borders and fail to enforce any kind of border control. Um, this kind of weird land that we've landed in. But anyway, so I jumped on that because it really hit that the essence of that how a little assumptionary and orientation points you entirely the wrong direction, and that one little choice that kind of we stumbled into, led us to this kind of situation we find ourselves in today, kind of aimless.
One of the thinkers that you've tied in with Boyd years ago that you made me aware of, I only knew him as the guy that interviewed John and Yoko, but Marshall McLuhan. You had a global guerrillas report back in 2018. It was called McLuhan at War, or McLuhan on War.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's in the conversation we've had thus far, I mean, you've really hit on multiple McLuhan topics. One was the global village. He predicted a global village, and it wasn't a good thing. It wasn't a good thing that through the hyper connectivity that we would all be inside of each other's business and things like that. The global village was actually something that was to be avoided. The other thing around, and I just tagged you on that note on Substack yesterday about network tribalism from his interview with Playboy in 1969, where he says that tribal search for identity is the path to violence. I mean, that's right. Violence comes from that. And then, of course, the big McLuhan theme is the medium is the message. And I think that's really the big one to talk about first, because I think they kind of explain the others, but it all ties really well with Boyd. What are your thoughts on some of that?
Well, I mean, the medium is the message, right? Is that when we wiped out nationalism by globalizing, taking that global perspective, is that, and we destroyed the story, the narrative that fueled that, intentionally destroyed that narrative. People sought for another one. They needed it. They needed that search for identity, led us to this tribal identity. And the tribal identities that we've ended up with are misshapen, they're broken. They're not positive tribal identities like why we are together, where we're going, how we're going to achieve more. They're tribal identities based on opposition. This is who we hate and how we hate it. And I don't think anything can come good, is good that could come out of that. It comes into it fills that vacuum. And then the global village insight, people were using it wrongly for decades. They were saying we're a global village in a good way. But global villagers were backbiters. They were gossipers. They were witch burners. They were engaged in pogroms. They killed everybody who didn't fit in at some point. Those guys are making too much money. The whole Salem witch trials was based on trying to land seizure and the like. It's a very bloody business, and we've created that environment in the online world, and we've destroyed the only things that actually could mitigate that or reduce the violence that comes out of that. That makes sense, or it's
no.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's amazing, and it goes back to another McLuhan theme that you talk about all the time, and so does Boyd, and that's pattern matching,
right?
And a conversation that you and I had back in May around a version of patterns of conflict that Boyd gave in '89 to the Marine Corps Command Staff College. The question was asked about using terror as a weapon. And basically what Boyd replied with is that you can do that, but you got to be really careful with that because, and here's why, because what you could do is not break the cohesion of the enemy. What you might actually do is reinforce them and solidify them. And it could blow back right in your face. And he said that in 1989. And you pointed out that was a phenomenal case of pattern matching.
Yeah, and that specific thing that he said was that really caught my eye was that any nation that goes into a war in the modern context where everything is reported, all this kind of feedback loops, even the TV stuff that he was talking about at the time, and we're way beyond that now, and that think that they can actually use kind of medieval violence levels or levels of violence that of the 1800s or before, is an idiot. They're going to get crushed by history. They're going to be rolled over. And it was exactly the same thing I was trying to make earlier with Israel's response, is that to October 7th, was that they were in a larger context, a larger war, an online war, and that nobody reined them in. A good president, good ally would have said right in the first week or two, said, no, stop this. You're going to destroy yourselves.
This is worth quoting because again, this is straight Boyd, and you could tie it to McLuhan and other things of what's going on. So the question from the audience said, Colonel, could you go to the last slide? He goes, basically the idea of terror, in other words, scaring your enemy badly enough before you get there so far as to unhinge him, sort of like the British did in the Falklands. They said they were bringing the Gurkhas and they're going to do bad things to the Argentinians when they catch them. Somewhere in your presentation, do you get on how we might use that today, given, congressional rules and media coverage? One of the things you're getting at with the Mongols here is that they terrorized people long before they actually showed up. So this is Boyd's answer. And I think, John, as you just alluded to, Boyd says, well, we've got these things today called terrorists, as a matter of fact. We call them terrorists, state-sponsored terrorism, etc. And the guerrillas use it very heavily. You've got to be careful on how you use it. And I'll be talking about that later. But one thing you want to do, you want to know your adversary. If you use terror, and you may also end up to actually goddamn build up his resolve and cause you big problems then too. In other words, you unify him against you. So if you're going to use that terror, you better understand how you're going to use it. Will it really pull him apart, or is it going to unify him against you? You can't just say, well, we're going to use terror, and then it may blow back on you like you wish you had never had it happen, blow back on you. And even if you could, right now, we have a lot of constraints. I understand that. But even if you could, you still want to be very careful with that stuff. It can blow back on you. And not only that, you have a different world today. Remember, in the world we talked about back here, they could run an operation against some goddamn empire, some group, and no one else had ever heard about it because they didn't have the communication. So by the time they heard about it, it was already over. Plus, they could not control it much better. Today, with all the TV and mass communication, you do something like that, you're in trouble. Remember, the world's changed. We've got to change whether we like it or not. If you just say bullshit, I'm going to do the same, you're still operating in an earlier century, and you're going to get cleaned. You're going to get taken out.
Yeah, you're going to get taken out. Exactly. Yeah, it started to even change back when the printing press had pamphleteering. Millions of pamphlets were coming out just prior to the U.S. American Revolution. There was pamphlets that came out about the East India Company and what they did during the famine, and didn't supply people with food. They enforced the taxes and extracted taxes out of people who were undergoing famine that was killing millions, right? And that information got back and was put into pamphlets. And the story was that the East India Company or something like that would come to the United States and start running the empire. Because the British Empire was built by companies. It wasn't like military conquest. Is that company would come to the United States and start running the colonies like a corporate enterprise. And that put the fear of God in everybody. Nobody wanted that. That's why, the Boston Tea Party happened. They took the East India Company tea and tossed it into the bay. So, that kind of stuff blows back, and it was just starting then, and people overlooked it. But now it's like, you have to pay attention to the environment you're in. You can't assume it's some kind of fantasy environment. You have to know where you're operating.
Hey, John, taking a look at Twitter and X over the last couple of years and where we are today. So Elon Musk, we talked about him on the last time we had you on the show. We talked about Elon Musk a little bit, but
yeah, sure.
Right here I'm looking at, and I'll share this on the screen. That is Elon Musk fully supporting President Trump. And we have, and for me, we have the flow of information. Information's flowing more today than it was 3-4 years ago at the height of COVID. So let me make sure you got this right. That's not the one I want.
Yeah, they're going to go after him for this.
Yeah. There we go.
The lawfare that they've been conducting lawfare against him, going after his small companies or big and his big companies for a while. But
right.
To openly declare support for Trump and now is going to make him a target.
I agree.
The earlier case of election denial was in the 2016 election, claiming that the social networks there actually were the cause of the election not going their way, that it was rigged, and that we spent years trying to, they put pressure on the networks to control their messaging and censor it heavily going into elections. Most of them complied. Facebook and all those others are all on board. And we've seen kind of lawfare being waged against companies and individuals who, have that kind of networking power in the past. And now that Elon's like declared, it's going to be intense.
Yeah.
Lawfare is a good one to talk about. That was one of the tenets of unrestricted warfare by the Chinese officers.
Right.
They talked about lawfare, and Osenga quotes that in the Boyd book, Science, Strategy, and War. He talks about lawfare. So, when you think of these mass naval showdowns in the South China Sea, I don't think you have to think that hard. I think you need to think about lawfare, drugs, TikTok, media influence, that kind of thing. That's more of a threat.
Yeah, I mean, Chinese are definitely playing across the entire board, and they're participating in just about everything.
Well, it seems they read Sun Tzu and paid attention.
Right. No, you have to use everything at your disposal to gain an advantage, and not be directly confrontational to the extent that you can.
Yeah.
But then do as best you can underneath the covers. I mean, 20 years of being hammered by Chinese hackers and stuff. If you talk to anyone, like my brother used to run the all-day hardware for the NSA. He's like constant attacks. I mean, across everything was just intense. And the same true with the kind of all these social aspects. I mean, you remember the Chinese citizen that went around tagging Jewish temples right during that. Yeah, no, they found a guy that went from place to place just after the conflict started, and he was going from state to state, putting Nazi symbols and stuff on, and he was a Chinese national that was just visiting. Yeah. Right, and that kind of stuff is like happening underneath the covers, and no one's really seems to be connecting any of the dots, or the people that are, they're like aren't kind of conveying it.
What's also telling is that an assassination attempt is made on a former president, and then at the same time people are still texting and talking about Richard Simmons passing away and Shannon Doherty passing away. Like people automatically shift to like, hey, what time is the game tonight? Oh yeah, that's great. It reminds me of when we learned that basically you're being recorded and surveilled via your own devices. And I remember that coming out in the news with people saying, that's cool. What time is Monday Night Football tonight? Who are they playing? Like people just don't even.
But it's also that in network tribalism, if things don't fit your pattern, they don't exist. Right.
That's it.
And that they're memory hold or they're forgotten. And even if people later prove a lot of your things, what you've said is incorrect. They said, well, it could have happened, or could have been that way, or should have been that way. This is just an anomaly. But people won't pay attention to things that fall outside their pattern.
Yeah, that's a surprise.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Well, Punch has these good visuals that, like, my favorite one is the chessboard. And it's like, well, which ones are these the same color or the different color? And you look at it, and you want to believe that they're different because the patterns of a chessboard, and the patterns of a silhouette, the patterns of a shadow. And in reality, they're the same color, and it never dawns on you. But those sorts of things, that's happening to us constantly, all the time. You're walking right past these things. It's right in plain sight. Which, by the way, I think that a lot of these things are hiding in plain sight. Yeah. I don't remember who it was, and John, maybe it might have been on. I don't think it was on a Global Glorious report. It was something was saying about how in the old days of the Cold War, classified information was vaulted down and buried, and no one would ever see the light of day. But now everything's out in plain sight. Nobody knows. Like nobody nobody cares because they can't match the patterns. I saw that somewhere, and I can't think of where I saw that, but
Oh no, I've often found that the open source information is usually a lot better than the kind of
the
classified stuff. Yeah, yeah, and also there's always that kind of funny thing inside these big organizations, particularly the big secret organizations, that they found that the siloed information created like all these errors in decision making. Same thing in finance. If you silo people into certain things, that they would be able to take advantage of opportunities and miss threats. And so when you opened it up and made their employees more powerful, giving them more access to information, you get people that compromise it and betray. So you have the rogue trader, or you have the rogue agent, or the rogue analyst. And so you're kind of caught in this, do I lock things up, or do I open things up to make my employees better?
That's what it's funny you mentioned a rogue trader, and I mean, my most recent Substack was on decentralized knowledge, and it was talking about Friedrich Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society, which every leader and every company should read. And this is something that Ponch and I talk about all the time. Information has to be flowing. It has to be free flowing. And so often, to your point, John, things are siloed, and people would say, well, we didn't think you need to know that. Well, we how would you know when you centrally plan all those things?
Yeah, well,
tacit and dispersed.
Exactly. Well, you can give people people miss a big part of what you need to do in order to open information like that, whether it's in a big agency like the NSA or CIA, opening up information silos so they could make better decisions, or whether it's in a bank or a brokerage firm or a trading house that opens up leverage to different traders, is that they give them more access, maybe more power. They give them motivation, but they don't really focus on their orientation enough. That you got to do things. That what you're effectively doing is giving these people mission orders without really checking to see if they have the orientation capable of actually executing on a mission order. That you have to know what the objective of what the commander's intent was, or the organization's intent was, and that knowledge has to be stronger than their motivation to improve their own well-being or their whatever external motivations that they have. So finding that or training that person for mission orders is tough, and I'd like to see more of it. That kind of training, because we're trying to open this information up and have that go. Clearly wasn't the case with the Secret Service in this recent thing. Everyone must have been just following their rote process. And I don't even know if they actually truly funded it. There's lots of complaints about the size of the detail and the amount of resources. Doesn't even appear that they have any protection for Robert Kennedy. Not Robert. Is it Robert? His name.
RFK Jr. And matter of fact, his most recent commercial, I saw it on Instagram. It shows his uncle and his father, coming to very abrupt ends after pursuing their agendas. Like Bobby Kennedy Jr. is putting that out right now. So,
his explanation for how that father died was nuts. Did you hear that?
No.
So the guy that was arrested or shooting him, he went through the details and said that guy never, after the first shot, never was had the gun in the right direction. In order that he was cinched down by the Secret Service and not allowed to even point at his dad, and that he was actually killed by the man behind him, who was a person that was known to hate his father. He was recently hired into the police force and assigned to the detail.
Yeah.
And he was right behind him, and that it shot him point blank, and that he had muzzle, burns on his neck where he was shot from behind. And that, that was never investigated or anything. It was all buried. And that's amazing charge to make. I mean, he's probably one of the few people that actually had the motivation to actually dig into this stuff. But it makes you think about, there's lots of things that could be buried and hidden and we're never going to fully realize exactly what happened as a group.
What's interesting about RFK Jr., he's been turned on, I believe. I mean, as I remember his career, the first time I really became aware of him was back in the fleet, right, where he was trying to shut down Vieques for environmental reasons, the gunnery range down in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
And you learn about him and you think, oh, well, this is just like some sort of left-wing environmentalist. And I always thought that he was kind of a hero of the left, and then until he wasn't, right? And it reminds me also too of Trump. I mean, the first time I remember coming into contact with Trump is at age 10 and getting The Art of the Deal for Christmas. And reading that book. And, Donald Trump was always kind of like this celebrity businessman that was, a real estate tycoon in New York, et cetera, but always very, I don't know, say useful until he wasn't, until all of a sudden, he goes from being this sort of socially liberal, adept businessman to becoming,
Did you see the trigger? You saw the trigger event for why you ran, right?
Obama, was it?
Yeah, that Obama speech where
he was running as a joke.
That he was, that it's a joke. There'd be just belittle the guy, and he was in the audience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and after that, that's kind of like one of those like high school humiliation level events. And for his ego, that was just
that's it.
It set in motion the whole thing afterwards.
So staying on topic, let's talk about like in the election of 2016, I think it was James Fallows that wrote National Defense in The Atlantic. He talked about how Trump had really mastered the OODA loop, and that he had understood orientation, and that he systematically took out all of his Republican opponents one by one by doing things that they couldn't answer, that they didn't have any answer for. And if I recall, if you Google Donald Trump OODA loop, there was a couple of articles about that and saying that, hey, look, I'm not voting for the guy, but he's a really master at this, this thought process. And
I want to build on that, Mark. But changing the system from within can't be done, right? So having an outsider try to change it is what I thought was happening with Trump in 2016, right? But now we have the possibility of corporate controlled media. You have the military industrial complex. You have all these things that are forcing, let's just say we go in a kitchen, you turn on the lights and all the rodents start running around and they want the lights turned off. That's what happened in 2016 is somebody went into DC, turned on the lights, showed everybody where all the rodents were, and the rodents turned on them. So this is kind of where I look at it from that lens.
Yeah, I mean, Trump had an interesting thing. He was nominally, focused on nationalism and national progress, and that was so incongruous with everything else that we've seen, all this kind of globalist perspective and based on those three things I was talking about earlier. To have somebody come in and kind of, even if you got all the facts wrong or whatever the rationale, even the arguments were combative, at least the orientation was pointed nominally in the right direction. It infuriated and confounded everybody. I mean, but it resonated at a deep level with so many people. That nationalist orientation was like, at least it's pointed in the right direction. It's like, that's what people responded to. That's what people were saying internally. But what we also found in his 4 years as president is that the system is way too powerful, that it prevented him from doing anything. I mean, the bureaucracy surrounded him like a cocoon and prevented almost every initiative, any attempt to control or change in direction was muted or redirected or delayed. There's also an argument that there's not been a real president for a long time, that the system is way too powerful and too complex, and that there's millions of people and they have these orientations and agendas that are going to win out in the end, regardless of what the president thinks or what the new administration thinks.
We talked about Hayek earlier in his paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society, that, again, if you're following Boyd, everybody should read this paper. It's not very long. But the other Hayek thing that just popped to mind as you were talking was this book, The Road to Serfdom, which is widely read and was widely understood by people that were, very aware of the pattern of control and central planning, and what it does to, individuals.
don't we feel, I mean, it's almost kind of like with this AI and the way things are headed in networks, that we're headed towards a similar road to serfdom. I mean, with the data mining and the data strip mining and inability to, and for everybody to see that all of this data they're putting out, not just a name and address and that kind of crap. I mean, I'm talking about every bit of data about their voice and their modulation, the way they put together sentences, the way they, everything they do, everything they write, everything they think, everything they say is being captured and turned into AIs. And these AIs will compete for your jobs, and they will compete for your attention, and they will going to be the most valuable things ever created, and they have no stake, even though they contribute everything to making them. And that, if that doesn't define what serfdom is, I mean, serfdom is you work all day at the fields, and it's not your field, and it's not your food that you're producing, but you're allowed to keep some to eat. And you have no ambition. You have no reason to actually work extra hours than the ones necessary to actually produce a minimum required. And that it took you remember Max Weber's twist on this is that the reason how we got out of serfdom, out of that serf mindset of never working extra hours, never accumulating, never creating wealth, is that we kind of took a Protestant ethic, trying to improve things, improve your life, improve yourself, and combine that with private ownership. And you had the private farms, and people accumulated. And that the U.S. served as kind of the model for all of this, is that people came in New England and the like, and Mid-Atlantic had all these private farms, and they accumulated wealth. And that wealth then created a market for manufacturing when it started emerging. And then that zoomed here faster than everything. Everything came out of that change in moving from serfdom to post-serfdom.
Literacy too, right? Literacy becoming more pervasive.
Oh yeah, but I mean, the idea that you have millions of households with wealth changed the whole focus of innovation. Innovation used to be, let's go build toys for wealthy people or weapons, or they didn't want vacuum cleaners. They had people for that. They didn't want dishwashers. They had people for that. They didn't want most things were covered by cheap labor and serfs. But you give it to a bunch of people, individuals who are working in a farm or, who've accumulated wealth. They want all those things. They're the mass market. They're the early adopters. They're the ones that move technology forward. And we're in the same kind of situation now.
Creation.
Yeah, but with data, we're in the same problem now. Is that, do we want to be people who are constantly training AIs to replace us, and we have to learn something more to teach AIs, and everyone, that's your job, is just to watch for errors in AIs and help them correct it, and so they don't need you anymore and you have to go to the next one? Or you have to learn something new in order to teach AIs? Or do you want to be, and you don't own anything, and these things are creating all the value going to a very small group of people? Or do you want to own a piece of that and move forward and have choice and have some input into how AIs are built and how they're used, and robots and all that other stuff. Anyway, it's way off track, but it's that shifting, and we're on a road to serfdom right now in kind of a digital realm.
Yeah, it seems like every attempt to build utopia on Earth doesn't always end well.
Yeah,
it never ends well, right?
Yeah,
it never ends well.
Well, hey, John. I'm curious, John, can you kind of project out 3, 6, 9, 12, 24 months? What's next? After the events from yesterday and where we are at the moment, what's next? What's this look like in your mind?
It gets wild. Anything that involves the decisions of individuals, it's hard to actually, do any projection. You can read basic trends and get a feel for how those trends are evolving. And I do think an intuitive sense is really the only way to actually, when you take into account a ton of information and kind of make projections based on that, it's the only way to actually see any kind of patterns emerging. Is that we're still on a path towards a global conflict with China and Russia and all their allies in the Middle East, basically the whole Middle East, except for Israel. and that I don't see anything abating that other than maybe a Trump presidency, and Trump could potentially swerve away from that. That makes him dangerous to everybody who has thinks that that's important to continue on that track. Yeah, my worry still is that World War III kind of global embargo, not a physical fight, is that China gets Taiwan, gets all the chips. They're all our manufacturing, all our high tech and everything else crumps. And nobody else in the world follows us into that embargo for invading Taiwan, and we die. I mean, we basically go through a implosion.
So John, we've had wars that we could watch on television for, we all fought wars for the last 20 plus years.
Right.
It was remote. For average Americans sitting in their $500,000 home that they bought for $200,000 a few years ago, what does this mean to them? What does war look like to them in the future? What's actually going to happen to their day-to-day life?
With a World War III with China? Well, China has nukes. Russia has nukes. We're not going to fight Chinese troops. As much as we say we're going to, there is a potential that we would stumble into or slouch into it if we started using drones. There's a kind of a weird myopia when it comes to drones, is that we think we've kind of convinced ourselves that using drones to fight their drones or actually destroy their troops doesn't really count as a confrontation. Unless we use human bodies on our side, our troops, our planes, our equipment, manned equipment attacking them is one thing. Using drones to do it is a thing. It's another thing entirely. That could be a slippery slope to kind of a nuclear or larger.
That's what we're seeing right now, and that's what I'm seeing anyway. Is just going back to Generation 2 warfare, right? With drones, attrition warfare, and I'm like, those are still humans on the other side that are
being killed. Right. Yeah, no, it does, but somehow it looks like a video game when you use the drones. It doesn't count. We see this in Ukraine, in Russia, and I think the threats recently made against China by saying we're going to put our advanced drones into the Taiwan Strait is the same kind of thing. No, if the restraint wins out, if they do take Taiwan and the like, and we end up in a World War III where you will end up with two trading blocks. And that already most of the European capitals have said they won't consider an invasion of Taiwan as a reason to disconnect from China. They're too dependent. They know it. And that the U.S. would be left alone. And what that means is that everything gets expensive. Everything goes into shortage. All our high tech goes to hell. Because all the chips, 80% of the chips and all the AI chips are all then in China's hands. And that our economy is totally trashed. And people who didn't think that we were in a war or even believed that the war should be necessary or that Taiwan was important are going to immediately go into massive dissent. Particularly if it's like a Democratic administration, the dissent will be on the right. If it's a Republican one at the time, it's going to be dissent on the left. But dissent will be widespread and growing and pretty much make up everybody in the population. And they'll force an end to the war. And that will be the end of any kind of American aspirations around the world. If it continues and we decide to fight, everything is going to be contested. So all trade will be contested. What China will do, and they can, we already see this in the kind of drone volumes, air, sea, and land, is that they will produce millions per year or millions per month. I mean, even Russia now can produce 300,000 a month. Is that they'll produce millions per month, and we can produce 10,000 a month at most, maybe 5,000. Less so after we get shorn of chips and advanced manufacturing from China. And they'll send those out to allies, like the Houthis and even Cuba or Venezuela, and arm them up and say, okay, exert some control, put some pressure on the United States. And then we end up with dozens of places that we actually have to, fight with in order to maintain some level of connectivity to the rest of the world, physical connectivity. And that turns into a nightmare. I just don't see how the U.S. could take out all of those. Plus,
Yeah.
Operate even when all our munitions, they all lead back to some kind of Chinese manufacturing capability. I mean, all the munitions we use in all our weapon systems are Chinese based. So, no, it will end badly for the U.S. And
is there any internal threat of drones being used on civilians here in the U.S.?
Potentially. I mean,
Okay.
we've I mean, that's a not so much on civilians. I would think it would probably be focused on systems and systems disruption. And so to accelerate the U.S. collapse, they would, we had an open border. We continue to have an open border. And the Chinese have made, big efforts to get people inside. It wouldn't take more than a couple trailer cars full of drones that have been repurposed, at least in the software. And those folks, dozen maybe, around major cities could unleash a barrage that wipes out critical electrical infrastructure, and other infrastructure could be wiped out. That's irreplaceable. That it can't be replaced.
Very low cost too, right? At very low cost.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. For a couple $1,000, you could be wiping out something that's worth $200,000-300,000 if you could buy, or $2-3 million, depending on the size of the equipment that you're wiping out at substations and the like. And you wouldn't be able to get replacements for it, particularly with an embargo. It would last for years. I mean, it would be basically the electrical system in the U.S. could go out. And
you wrote in Brave New War about how just a couple of $1,000s of explosives, they shut down, 650 million in Iraqi oil profits, like instantly, just right off the,
this could be like one of those big sustained, maybe 1 week or 2 week level campaign. And then it sets in motion the kind of chaos that then, you get partial disruptions everywhere, long running blackouts that go for months. And then you start to get local groups involved, and they start to, supply power, and then they're working against the resumption of power, and they start to tax it, and people start to, groups just emerge out of the woodwork and start to exert control because there's, so much chaos. And you create this kind of cycle of more disruption creates more opportunity, and those people tend to get very, very wealthy. There's lots of wealth in a failed state, in a broken state, and they could potentially put us into that with disruption plus an embargo.
George Carlin said in his HBO special "Life is Worth Losing," you want to see things get crazy in the United States, turn the power off.
Yeah,
like if you shut the power off, everything would just go to abject chaos.
Oh yeah, and especially in the middle of the summer or in the middle of the winter. I mean, it would be, especially, because so many people now are relying on like heat pumps and they switch this over to electrical completely. They don't have any alternatives. It's bad news. So I don't think it would hit individuals or hit crowds. At least not at this stage. I mean, though, in terms of internal suppression, I mean, if you put it forward about 10 years and we start to get to, micro drones with small explosives, and you get the, lots of intelligence, onboard intelligence, ability to go through, whether crawling or flying or combination of the two, good sensors, good decision-making capability, you could make millions of those and suppress a city.
Yeah.
Okay. And control a city and make it impossible for anyone to do, fly those suckers in, make some examples. Nobody's going to say or do anything that would actually even impede the person controlling it.
So, John, this orientation that you're talking about, and I actually share with you, is built upon years of experience, research, understanding history, right? Not everybody's going to have this anticipatory thinking capability to think like this. I kind of feel like you do from your background. I do from my background and working in Air and Space Operations Center from a Navy perspective. Or active duty, it was my job to freaking figure out how to terrorize people full time, right? I mean, that was my job, was to sit there and go, how can I fuck with our enemies with our weapon systems that we can't talk about, you know, in a cyber world, and then how do we affect change or get what we want out of that? Now we come back here and we're civilians, and you know, we're enjoying our freedom, and we're looking at this saying, this is what I see happening all around us. And like I said, not everybody shares this view. A lot of folks are so worried about which pronoun they want to be you know, to use today, right? And that doesn't bother me. I'm like, yeah, you can color your hair, you can pierce your nose, you can do all that crazy shit, but what matters to me is survival, right? This is what I think about during the day. And what I really want is, I want people to leave me alone. I just want to live, man. I just want to have a high quality life. I don't want to have to worry about you know, gas going through $7-8 a gallon. I don't want to have to live through hyperinflation. I know that printing money is dangerous, right? I know that you know, when somebody says you got to pay your fair share, I'm like, well, let's go fucking get a pizza together and we'll talk about paying our fair share, right? You know, I mean, explain how that works to me. So again, John, my point on this is, our orientation is built upon years of previous experience, a lot of knowledge, a lot of reading, including John Boyd's work. You've written books on this. We're not coming from this as from a perspective of you know, let's say this to be controversial. We're saying this to warn folks. And now, thoughts, Mark? I mean, what are you thinking about now?
Yeah, I find that the more that I dig into Boyd and McLuhan and Hayek and others, the more aware I become of how our orientations are synthetically shaped into hive minds, you know, and formed into hive minds. And you have to be very, very careful, because the medium is the message. We are on the road to serfdom. And as Boyd would say, we cannot determine the nature of a character of a system within itself, right? And the more that we attempt to do so, we create more confusion and disorder. And it's not unlike just any conversation you have with anybody, whether we're consulting in a company or anywhere else. It's like, just read Destruction and Creation and try to understand what's actually happening. And then I find that you become more aware of how you've been put into boxes, or you're acting involuntarily because you think that you're part of this perceived tribe or that kind of thing. And I find that the more I get into it, and the more you start to look at universal realities, which I think Boyd, Hayek, McLuhan, I think that they were chasing after those things and trying to observe and explore, less to tell us exactly what's going on, because they were always revising their models. You know, the less inclined I am to be part of any group, you know, because it's again, I kind of touched on Carlin earlier, but boy, if you go back and you look at Carlin's stuff, he was saying that being a part of any group is not always a good thing, because you start to not think anymore. And once you lose that capacity to critically think, you lose that capacity for free and independent action, as Boyd would say, and the medium does become the message, as McLuhan would say, and then you're on the road to serfdom, as Hayek would say. It is interesting, but it's hard to refute.
It's harder to know that you're actually in a group or not now. Like with the
does
network,
a fish
right?
know he's in water, right?
Right. So you go out to the network and you just go with the flow. You know, it's like the resonance. You know, like all these people are thinking this one thing, and the people just kind of go in that direction. They're not officially part of a group. There's no membership card. It's just like, oh, the network's moving in this direction. Let's like
a school of fish.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Or, you know, I'll amplify that, and people will amplify me if I amplify that. No, yeah, it's and truly independent thought, trying to, you know, do it, strike off on your own is not rewarded, right? So if you come in and say something that's like objectively true, insightful, but it doesn't fit into any of the dominant tribal flows, it won't get any traction. It will from hard-won experience forever. This is like, it happens all the time. And it could be really great insight, but it just doesn't resonate with the tribal messaging and thinking and the pattern matching. So you're part of, you know, in order to have any kind of prominence and any kind of spin or any kind of amplification. You have to do stuff that actually fits in somewhat.
Right? Yeah, that's what Boyd called incestuous amplification.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's feedback loops here.
Yeah.
I mean, feedbacks that are more deliberate and more, visible than you would see, and they're all dynamic, and it changes day by day. But everyone's part of a group.
Last week, I was on a working ranch in Colorado doing 2 days of work, as quote unquote vacation, right? And it was amazing with cattle how once one does something and you get that second one to do it, the rest of them follow without hesitation, without question. And it is interesting to see that pattern, because it seems to me like this is sort of the network tribalism pattern. 1, 2, 3 start doing it, and you want that affinity. You want that belonging to the group. You want that belonging to the tribe. You want that identity. Yep. And the next thing you know, you're being led to your slaughter, and you didn't have any idea. We didn't slaughter any cattle. We were just doing branding and vaccinations of cattle. But it is interesting though that you surrender that sort of autonomy when you and your ability to challenge all assumptions, as Boyd would say. When you start to group up together and you don't critically think anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it in like the case of Boyd, how many people would come up to him and say, "Hey, you were right, but I really wanted to get that star. I really wanted to get that second star."
Yeah. Yeah. Is the thinking of a truly independent individual even valuable now? I mean, truly. I mean, somebody that can seed a change in with some insight in a tribal group, or introduce some ideas that are eventually picked up by a tribal group. Those people are valuable. But most people inside these tribal groups aren't. In a negative way, it would be like an NPC kind of. They're relinquishing their independent thought for some kind of security and tribal identity, or not even official tribal identity. I'm just happy other people agree with me. And reinforce me and pat me on the back a little. And it's comforting. It's comforting in a world where which doesn't make a lot of sense in many instances. Things are moving too fast. Things are crazy. Things that you never thought would happen 20, 30 years ago happen routinely now. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, who would have thought that the battery would have been gone? I mean, the border would have been gone. That no one enforced it. They would actually bulldoze down the barriers, right? And take down the fences and not enforce anything. But for all intents and purposes, not enforce anything, with millions of people coming through and never even touching a border agent or whatever. I mean, that's impossible to think that was impossible.
Why? I mean, why? What advantages does anybody have in doing that? I mean, this goes back to that.
Part of it was
dampen.
They set in motion procedures that in reaction to Trump. So much of this stuff that's gone off the rails is reaction to Trump. Yeah. So, a lot of the excessive lawfare that's being used against them, damages the judiciary, damages the legal process, because it's so blatantly like way over the top. I mean, manufacturing laws are coming up with new interpretations, novel interpretations, usually, makes everything associated with that suspect. And then the same thing with the border and the border reaction. They got rid of the facilities they had in Mexico and rolled the procedures back to an area that was not well thought out, to the point where it became, we're not going to have anything that's inhumane or any kind of border or any kind of fencing on the that would force people to potentially drown and maybe loss of one life or whatever. And so that started the ball rolling. And then, with increasing inflation and decreasing, at least at the manual or semi-skilled level, decreasing amount of people that would work for reasonable wages and work diligently. Mm-hmm. There was a huge pressure inside the industry and all of those light industry and in other areas to get more workers. Yeah. Yeah. And they wanted illegal workers because they thought they would be more malleable. And then it went out of control because when they kind of allowed that, And there's also kind of thinking on here are voters that are potentially future Democratic voters, particularly given the Republican stance on immigration. So combine all that, and then things got out of control because then you start running into the homeless laws that were put in place. So they eliminated homeless by trying to get them into facilities and made it mandatory you offer the facility. But the reason that most of the homeless aren't in the facilities is because they won't stop taking the drugs, which are banned in the facility, or stop drinking. So that's why they're homeless. Because not that the facility doesn't exist, it's that they won't accept the conditions for getting in there. And then all these illegals turn up, and then they have to house them.
Yeah.
And then they run out of housing, and then they run into multi-billion-dollar deficits in New York City and other places, and then it just spun out of control. It just turned.
It's catch-22,
right? And the system's driving the behaviors. You have these unintended consequences. It's complex, right? It's not one thing; it's many things.
Right?
Yeah.
No, it's it's all based on these old, rotten assumptions. I had a thing where that a lot of times where empires fall and big organizations fall apart is that they were previously successful and they built, based on good, solid assumptions. Some of those were changed just slightly or tweaked over the course of the years, and eventually nobody was asking about those assumptions. No one was questioning them, and they ended up becoming rotten. And we should be in Afghanistan nation building, even though it was apparent after the first 6 or 7 years that it was not working, and it wasn't going to ever work. I mean, I got in 2009 in front of the Armed Services Committee. I said, "What should we do?" And they said, "We should come up with an excuse to leave Afghanistan and leave now."
Yeah,
right. That was in 2009, and that was $1 trillion later, $1.5 trillion later. We're evacuating on the from a besieged airport. So no, it's assumptions aren't questioned, and they go rotten, and now we have them everywhere. These are kind of rotten cores that everything is built on, and no one will actually go back. They can't even be talked about.
Yeah.
You couldn't talk about leaving Afghanistan inside of the military. Truly.
Yeah.
You couldn't, and you couldn't talk about so many things that in the press now, because it wouldn't even be a conversation that they would, maintain or hold. They would just dismiss you as a crank. And that's another, a lot of that had to do with the globalization focus versus the nationalist focused. And that's why Trump was he would actually ask those questions. Like, why aren't we doing this? And people are like, well, you're not even allowed to. You're not allowed to ask that question. Yeah. So,
well, that brings to another thing too. A lot of the people that bring up the challenging assumptions are like a Boyd or a McLuhan or a Hayek. I mean, they're so radically opposed.
They're all cult figures though too, right?
Well, that's
none of those guys ever end up mainstream. They're always cult and always on the edge, but they were the truth tellers. They were the truth seekers.
Yeah.
And they changed the dynamic and in many ways, but they're not going to ever be recognized as the big central figures that everyone.
So here's a question: a lot of times in these political upheavals, there's a revolution and then there's a reaction. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell who's the revolution and who's the reaction, because I feel like the ones who call themselves revolutionaries are actually pretty heavily backed by the corporate behemoth so much that they're more the reaction. If it just kind of seems flipped. What do you a lot of times the left seems to be the revolution and the right seems to be the reaction, but it kind of seems to be the other way around right now.
Oh, I mean, the right is more of a revolutionary kind of force here. Force for change, yeah. So it's all kind of flipped around, and the left is actually the mainstream establishment. Yeah, no, but it's also a complex, multipolar, hyperpolar kind of world. There's so many different players and so many different motivations. You have all these corporations involved, and they have different kind of agendas and seek different outcomes. I mean, you have nation states and deteriorating nation states. And they have different, agendas and desires, and you have these network tribalism. What? Yeah.
Oh no, we were losing you. That they were censoring us.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but no, it's hard to make sense of anything now.
Yeah.
And
John, I got a couple last. I know it's Sunday morning, and thanks for joining us.
yeah, you're welcome.
This is a great conversation. A couple other questions from you. One, you don't have to get to this now, but what's the way out of this? And just this being the context we're in, we can come up to that later. But one of the things I want to know from you is we're getting data from our government, economic data, and it changes. It gets revised back to something, and hey, it wasn't 350,000 jobs; it was 5. Whatever.
Right.
I'm exaggerating there. What's the purpose of lying to us? Why are we being lied to? Are we being lied to?
Sure, of course we are. I mean, but it's like people who are thinking that they're actually doing us a favor. I mean, almost every time that we talk about misinformation nowadays, it's always about interpretation of existing facts. And granted, and there was also this kind of a looseness in terms of how people interpreted assumptions. So an assumption error leads to wrong reporting or number being reported, or an over-optimistic assumption leads to a wrong number being reported. And when the actual data comes in that proves that overestimation is wrong and corrects it back, they won't apologize. But because the value was already achieved. So in general, though, it's getting harder and harder to trust anything coming out of the government, which is a shame, particularly since it's engaged in such aggressive, lawfare and self-protection. All abuses, all unnecessary. And it's easy to come up with a lot of little short-term things that we could do, but I think the things that we have to focus on would be keeping power as far away from the center as we possibly can. Okay, and trying to decentralize it to the extent we can, so we can prevent some of the worst abuses coming out of this environment. The worst abuse, I think, would be to create a kind of a network authoritarian state like we see in China. And networks tend to concentrate power, especially with AI and everything else. It's that's my biggest fear, is we end up in that, kind of slouching our way into that.
It's the road to serfdom.
Yeah. We and that any kind of dissent is considered misinformation, and that and suppressed and punished. Which then, at a very, very deep level, if you can get into every single conversation and it's everywhere, and it controls your perception of reality. As we get AR to do anything, we're going to have AR. That's a very dire and horrible future. And then, at a nominal level, some increasing focus on nationalism, kind of the George Washington's approach. Not nationalism and aggressive nationalism were taking over things. It's just like focus on America and knowing what America actually is all about, and about the prosperity, mutual prosperity, and progress, and pursuit of happiness on a mass scale, and making that possible by untangling ourselves from all these alliances and dependencies, and treating the world as a potential trading partner and a potential partner for doing things together, rather than control games and trying to manage the world, and in creating Kissinger with trying to create conflicts in order to keep them roiled, in order to manage them more effectively, right? It's like and unwinding some of the defense expenditures that we have that would focus on increasing our economic output. And Washington said that that's during times of peace we should be balancing the budget by taking advantage of that opportunity. But, doing that's going to be tough. There's so many people with different identities or like different loyalties that are pulling us in directions that towards war and towards expenditures and towards policies that are detrimental to the future of the United States. And they have an outside level of control over our society. And I'm talking all the identities like that are out there, all the different loyalties that are competitive with our national identity. I do think that Washington's thing, focus on saying citizenship in the United States has value. You should be loyal to that. It has benefits. And then we could make those benefits more tangible, more visible. That if you do X, for a long enough time, you're going to get Y, and that you could you're a participant. If the GDP goes up by 100% in a decade, your benefit for being in this country should be 100% better if you contributed and it shouldn't be like some loose connection, right? I mean, we broke that connection years ago in the 70s when we saw median income stagnated, and we doubled or quadrupled the GDP in that same period of time since then. So making it more tangible, making it more real, that citizenship has value, membership. And in a network where there's so many different choices, that could be a detractor. Create an opt-in situation that you're opting into participation would be a good thing. But translating all this into policy and, data ownership is one of the ways to do it, is tough. It's a long discussion, and I don't see a lot of initiatives to try to do it. So, hey, there we are.
John, we're glad to have you as, intellectual partners on this as we continue to develop and build on the theories of the the giants of the whose shoulders we stand on, Boyd, McLuhan, and others. And we really appreciate your time on a Sunday on such short notice to hopefully get more people to start challenging assumptions and critically think and understand the OODA loop sketch.
Great, guys. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's fun.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm just going to pause here.
Good.